Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Conversation of Power episode. In today's conversation, we will continue try to understand the ongoing war in Iran and its regional and maybe broader geopolitical implications around the world. The the pace of war, I think, are changing per seconds. Even not uh, the more senior analysts, maybe the combination of the professor, I think they're not able to following the situation because the things I think in this geopolitical environment they are changing the past not even per second, maybe per mile or the pace of the hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles when they target us somewhere. Next second you are thinking about you hearing about another things about news. We start with the killing of the Khamani. Later, Ali Larijani is a more senior Iranian IRG person, and many other high-ranking commanders and politicians in Iran has been targeted and killed by the USI strikes. Yes, all these things are changing as a society rapidly. The implications is, I think, the war is already became the regional. The Iran, per its capability and military power projection, it responded and it targeted many Gulf countries, starting from the Dubai, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel as well, and the the Kurdistan regional government has been another target in the city of Erbil and Suleimania. Uh, but Erbil and Suleimania are being targeted mostly by the Shia pro-Iran militias. I think not direct. Maybe some ballistic missiles target this region as well. Iran targeted the USA defenses in the region, try to block the Strait of the Hormuz. And as we know, the United States move, at least I think most recently it was the two-thirds of its navy. It is a huge military capability. It's strategic bombers in the region, the ice defenses, and the nuclear power submarine, nuclear capable submarine are in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and Mediterranean, all are the scope. And really many people, not even the lay audiences, the decision makers, the PhD students, all educated people, they are thinking about the future prospects of this war. What will be the next stage? What will happen to the regional countries? Did the US will be able, or the US will be able to successfully change the regime? Is there any alternative in Tehran? Mm, and there is, the another consequences in terms of the energy and economy and trade. Many Asian countries from the ASEAN region, Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, maybe Thailand, Bangladesh, and all other Northeast Asian countries as well, like the South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, maybe China as well. They are deeply dependent, maybe like the Japan. Persian 90, they imported its oil from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of the Hormuz, and this region, us now under the has been blockaded under the missiles. But my knowledge and maybe practical experience will of course be limited as a podcaster and YouTuber. Although I'm a political scientist, I have a background in political science, and great power competition is my area of specialization. But I have better guests than me today. She has practically living and reading, writing on the region. I'm joining by assistant professor Dr. Monica Marks. She will be joining me today from United Arab Emirates. And Monica is a scholar of the Islamist movement. This is quite important because we are talking about now the war is ongoing between the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, not the secular Iran, not the liberal Iran, that is Islamic. And I think this is most important part of the Monica's area of research to understand the background of these developments. And Monica also is I think the gender studies are part of her research, which we witnessed the women movements among the protesters, the arrests among the protesters in Iran. There is the hijab issues and so many other things related to women. The Monica also interested in Middle East politics and North Africa. Her research focuses on broad topics across the region and beyond. I think this is good to understand the broader implications from Middle East, North Africa to Asia as well. Prior to joining NYUAD, Dr. Marx was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University's Waterhouse Center for International Affairs. She completed her PhD an ethnographic study of the post-11 Tunisian politics based on over 1,200 in-country interviews. This is an amazing number as well as a PhD for a PhD thesis in 2018 at St. Antonius College, Oxford. Yes, Monica, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Monica, just let's back to the starting point of these developments of this war. When going back to the morning of the February 28th, according to your assessments and observations as a living in the region, what was the decisive trigger that pushed the case of indirect confrontation between the Iran and the US and its allies, and shadow conflict like the Iranian proxies into the full-scale war that we are watching today?
This is a very predicted war. I think what's been unpredicted is how deeply the United States failed to plan in advance for this war, and how absolutely elementary my country, the United States, I'm American, my country's miscalculations have been in this war. Regional experts, scholars, analysts had widely predicted that there was going to be another bigger conflagration between the US and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other since last summer's 12-day war in June of 2025. Although President Donald Trump claimed to have, quote, obliterated Iran's nuclear program, very few people actually believed that. And more importantly, we all knew that Netanyahu, the leader of Israel's goals for decimating what Israel has long viewed as the Iranian threat, had not yet been met. So we knew that there was very likely to be another larger round of fighting that could provoke a regional war. In fact, a lot of people had feared that regional war was going to break out and explode like we're seeing now last summer. In fact, Gulf states and Turkey were very afraid of that and had all lobbied Washington, D.C. last summer against it, arguing very strongly that Iran was likely to block the Strait of Hormuz. In every single war game, that was one of the first things that Iran would do. I've been thinking over the past 3 weeks, if I was teaching even a smart class of 8th grade, 14 or 15-year-old students, and I presented them with maybe like a one-page case study on this conflict and assigned them the role of Iran, and I gave them maybe just 1 or 2 hours, I would predict that most students would close the Strait of Hormuz if they were role-playing Iran in that war game, even if they were 14 or 15 years old. That's how obvious of a move it was. So Turkey and all of the Gulf Arab countries were very concerned about this, especially the Gulf Arab countries like Dubai, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi. I mean, their economies were very, very vulnerable to the Strait of Hormuz being weaponized in this way. Why I think it happened now has a lot to do with Donald Trump's alleged successes in the foreign policy arena between last June and today. Israel was pressing the whole time, and in fact, Israel and Netanyahu in particular have pressed multiple US presidents for this over many years. But all the other presidents understood that this was opening up Pandora's box, opening up a can of worms that was extremely dangerous. But I think Donald Trump over the past year gained a lot of confidence, in part through the fact that he pressured for a ceasefire in Gaza. We know that Palestinians have still been killed in their hundreds since that ceasefire was accorded in October, but it did slow down the fighting a lot, and it got the remaining Israeli hostages back in Israel, and it improved the humanitarian situation from being absolutely horrifically, unthinkably, Palestinians would argue genocidally dire, to being at a slower burn, just horribly, awfully dire. Trump also, in January, I think even more importantly, replaced the leader of Venezuela, Maduro, with his number two, essentially. Essentially, Donald Trump made the vice president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who was an opportunistic, more pragmatic regime insider, the number one. It was not regime change, it was a regime tweak that just changed the Maduro regime from being very ardently anti-United States to being more willing to work with US interests. This was not a regime change. This was not a democratization of Venezuela by any stretch of the imagination. It was a much more limited operation. But I think all of those things together contributed to a sense of invincibility for Donald Trump himself, gave him more trust in some of the advisors like Rubio, who had argued for that action in Venezuela, and also, just as importantly, made a lot of analysts and critics within the Trump's MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, a little bit more self-censoring or circumspect about their criticisms of war with Iran last summer. If you look at the internal dialogue that preceded the 12-day war and happened during it last summer, people were a lot more critical. But I think there were a lot of people who were thinking to themselves, Donald Trump has been criticized right, left, and center by so many people, and yet it seems like he pulled things off in Venezuela. So maybe let's lay off of him about Iran. So I think all of these things came together with Israel's ongoing pressure campaign and its allies within Washington, D.C., including people very, very close to Donald Trump. And finally, Netanyahu got what he wanted, and Trump decided to bite the bullet and do it. I don't think that Trump was told the truth. If he had been told the truth, he would have been told, you, President, are about to open Pandora's box. You, Mr. President, are about to drastically increase prices at the gasoline pump for Americans and around the world. And you're about to decimate the economies and security situation of your Gulf Arab allies in the most important strategic energy transport waterways anywhere on the planet. And you're also going to disrupt a lot of aviation and many other important things like humanitarian logistics, not that Trump has ever really cared about that. The fertilizer, very important for growing food and keeping down food prices, et cetera. And this is also very likely to give more power to Iran because it's going to be able to weaponize these waterways and then maybe pressure you for more of what it wants. So I think had he been told the truth about all of this, he would not have pulled the trigger. I think instead he was probably told, this is going to be a very quick operation. Look what you did in Venezuela. You're going to be able to repeat something like this now. So on February 28th, the US and Israel decided to start this war, despite all the pressure that they had from basically every other country in the Middle East. How did it feel in Dubai? How did it feel in the Gulf to be sitting there when this war started? Around midday on Saturday, February 28th, I saw the news that the war had started. And within the next hour, I also saw news that the UAE had been bombed. A number of different states in the Gulf Cooperation Council and the GCC were being bombed immediately by Iran. And it wasn't just, and here was the surprising part, it was not just the United States bases and military installations in the region. From the very beginning, Iran also started targeting civilian infrastructure, things like airports, ports. It would later expand to banks, residential buildings, etc. So Iran really, within the first number of hours on Saturday, February 28th, climbed multiple rungs up the escalation ladder. I think everybody had expected that it was going to close the Strait of Hormuz and target US bases and military installations in Gulf Arab states. But what was really shocking and very, very concerning, of course, to live through was to see completely unpredictable parts of your city that you frequented, hotels whose restaurants you've eaten in, buildings where your friends live, airports that you fly out of multiple times a month being struck by missiles and drones. By that afternoon, by about 5 p.m. on that afternoon, I was standing on my balcony, looking up at the sky, seeing missile interceptions happen, which was something not only had I never seen in my life, even though I've lived most of my adult life in the Middle East and North Africa, I've lived in countries like Tunisia and Turkey and the UAE for the majority of that time that, thanks to God, haven't known the direct impact of war. So it was really quite shocking to live through. And in the weeks since, it's become clear that this is going to get worse and it's going to last longer, and that Trump has absolutely no war termination strategy.
Monica, just let me drawing over your assessments, your observations. When we look at the opening of the strikes of Operation of the Epic Fury, do you see them as a carefully calculated effort to dismantle the regime and the regime's core security institutions, or this strategy ultimately, as I think partly today we are witnessing, triggering a much broader regional escalation? And I want to just make an additional comment. According to your observation, do you believe that President Donald Trump and the security advisor wrongly compared Venezuela with Iran, and all this comparison give the false self-confidence, or they already know that Iran will be irresistible, they will resist fiercely, but they have to go in their way?
Yeah, I absolutely think that Venezuela was wrongly conflated with Iran. I think Trump wanted to believe that. I don't think he's informed enough about the internal organizational structure, let alone histories and internal political culture of these various countries, to be able to complete that comparison himself. And I think that there were a lot of people around him. He has a very closed ideological clique around him that includes absolutely none of the top experts on Iran. Absolutely no expert whatsoever. There's zero expertise on Iran that's coming up to Trump through this small ideological clique. It's really something amazing. I mean, it makes the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, which of course, as we know, turned out to be a real debacle for the United States that lasted far beyond George W. Bush's claims of mission accomplished just a few months in on that famous aircraft carrier. For those of us old enough to have lived through it, Lokman, you might remember as well as I do living through that moment. But it makes that moment look like rocket science, look like PhD level, incredibly informed planning compared to this ad hoc absurdity that we saw unfold in the US invasion of Iran just now. So, I think there were a lot of people feeding him this Venezuela comparison. Some of them, I think themselves, were analytically limited, but I think others really understood the picture and had much more manipulative, malicious motives. They knew what they were doing, and they wanted a war. I think some of them falsely believed that if they opened Pandora's box, they really could change the regime in Iran. Which brings me to your question, your initial question: was Operation Epic Fury really planned for regime change? If I could comment on the planning about that. Yeah, I think Donald Trump and those around him, like Defense Secretary, now Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, said multiple times publicly that this really was a regime change war. Donald Trump invited Iranians to step up and take back their government once we clear the way. He said this may be your only chance for generations to clear your government. So, to his credit, at least, he didn't necessarily commit the United States to doing every part of this regime change operation, but he did go in with the idea that we would be opening the way to a historic regime change. And that's certainly how that's certainly how Iran's regime understood it, which is why they behaved so existentially, lashing out in these ways that look absurd, that look crazy and unhinged to so much of the world. But what the United States government missed, that almost anyone who reads one single decent book about the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, its history since 1979, I highly recommend Vali Nasser's excellent book on this topic that just went through a second printing last year in 2025. That's an excellent book to start with for people who read nothing about it. But there's no way to read that book and not understand what I'm about to tell you, which is this. This is not a regime that is vulnerable to decapitation. This is a very different can of worms than Venezuela in so many different ways. The Venezuelan regime was very top heavy, so it was much more vulnerable to decapitation, to taking Maduro out. Not that we did regime change in Venezuela. We didn't. We did just a little regime tweak. We just made the number 2 the number 1 under the understanding that she was going to get along with the US better. But another important difference from Venezuela is that they have very, very different histories of US military intervention. The vast majority of Venezuelans in Venezuelan political culture really do not like the Maduro regime and were very relieved when the United States took out Maduro. But people in the Middle East, and in Iran in particular, feel 100% different. Even when they hate their regimes, the last thing that they want is an external power, especially the United States, given our recent history with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which went terribly, looking at how we pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021 with desperate Afghans who were terrified of the Taliban literally hanging off the wheels of our planes, and yet we left them there. Under Biden, who was one of our more sane, more knowledgeable foreign policy presidents, that still happened. So they look at all these different things and they say, this is the last thing we want. Iran in particular has a very difficult history of US intervention. In 1953, the United States and Britain conspired together to try and orchestrate a coup, which Iranians arguably completed themselves. That's Valdi Nasser's argument and the argument of some other Iranian scholars. But the US definitely had a big hand in creating the conditions, at the very least, for a democratically elected nationalist named Mossadegh, who was trying to nationalize Iranian oil, to be kicked out. And in his place was put the Pahlavi king, the Pahlavi Shah, back on his peacock throne. And Iranians did not take well to that. Even though this Pahlavi Shah was not nearly as repressive about lifestyle issues as the Islamic regime that came to power in 1979, he was much more pro-Western. There were more personal freedoms for people, but he was incredibly repressive politically. So for critics of the king and of monarchy, and for people who supported democracy or criticized any part of his regime, be they on the more Islamist right or on the more secular, even Marxist left, they were very often imprisoned, tortured horrifically, had their genitals electrocuted. The Shah's secret police, Savak, was infamous for the torture techniques that it used. And the entire time, the United States was really supporting this regime. This also happened to be a very pro-Israel regime. It was overthrown in 1979 in a coalition of far left and far right. And the Marxist left and the Islamist right came together for one issue: opposition to Western interventionism and control of their country, and a desperate desire to take back sovereignty. And that's what enabled 1979 to begin with. And that's the ideological politics in which this Islamic regime curdled and solidified. And then immediately in 1980, it faced war from Iraq. Saddam Hussein, who was then backed by the West, including the United States, invaded Iran. And there was a terribly bloody 1980 to 1988 war between these two countries. So this brand new, radical, revolutionary, anti-Western, America's the great Satan regime really formed and consolidated through the crucible of an extraordinarily bloody war. And it became more pro-martyrdom throughout that war. Its ideology hardened. Tens of thousands of children were volunteered, and their parents volunteered, and they were sent to and indoctrinated to go to the war front and be like literal human minesweepers. They would run across the front line, and those who ran over mines would just be blown up. And then the adult forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, would run in behind them. So what I'm trying to say through all of this, and I could keep going on, but what I'm trying to say through all of this is that this is not a regime vulnerable to outside regime change, certainly not from its great enemies that bring together the left and the right and have done so for decades, Israel and the United States. I'll just say one last thing on that topic. The Iranian regime has prepared for decades for some kind of huge regional war like this. So they had at least 4 different layers underneath the top assigned to take their places at pretty much every level. They're organized almost more like a counterinsurgency or terrorist group than a normal dictatorship. This is a much flatter, horizontal, authoritarian system. And, just in January, this regime gunned down tens of thousands of peaceful protesters in Iran. This is a regime that's not afraid to use ruthless, horribly cruel force against its own people to stay in power. And if you talk to Iranians who have recent experience living inside it, a lot of them would have told you in January or February, if you want to do regime change from outside, not only do you run the risk of actually creating a rally around the flag effect and empowering this regime, because everybody who hates the regime is going to hate outside intervention even more, especially if you bomb civilian sites, like the US and Israel have been doing since day one. On day one, our opening salvo, we accidentally bombed a girls' school and killed over 165 little girls. And since then, the two countries together, the US and Israel, have bombed energy infrastructure. They've bombed water desalination plants, things that are absolutely crucial for civilian life. They've even accidentally bombed UNESCO World Heritage sites, like in Isfahan, this amazing city of Persian civilization, and in Gulistan, like the Gulistan Palace. So Iranians, even those who hate the regime, say, this is completely wrong. If this is what liberation looks like, many of them, of course not all, but many of them would say, if this is what liberation looks like, we don't want it. And that makes it even harder for them to come out and protest and create coalitions against the government. So this was an incredibly ill-advised step.
Monica, you painted an amazing picture towards an American establishment and foreign policy, maybe security advisor or decision makers. But let me look at back to the Iranian side. The first, since the war is beginning, we know the killing of the supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Later, as I initially said, Ali Larijani, the commander of the Basij, and many other high-ranking commanders has been killed and targeted by the U.S. and Israeli targets. Do you think that this is a signal of a deeper transformation within the such as the Revolutionary Guard, clerical establishment, and the other political actors within the system? Because this is important for, sometimes, some reports suggest that the number of the missiles is decreased, and next day you see the number of the missiles increase, as you maybe indirectly mentioned that the Iran using the mosaic response system or defense systems. Now their missiles maybe being fired, launched from the provisional systems. That is, maybe we can talking about the decentralized military establishments. All these things, how will affect the internal power dynamics in Iran, specifically in IRGC, and as I say, the establishment of the clerics and the other political apparatus. What will be your takes?
Yeah. Remind me of the very first part of your question again.
I said, the most important figures within the regime has been assassinated and killed.
Oh, yeah. Now I understand. Yeah. So, I think Middle East analysis, Middle East coverage, Middle East scholarship even, the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that it itself is very ideologically polarized, and people can fall into tribalized, biased buckets. There are people who are just more likely to be sympathetic to Iran and very against US regime change wars on the one hand, and there are people even within journalism, academia, scholarship who tend to be more sympathetic with Israel or with the US, or just very, very against Iran. Some of them have lived experience of living maybe in either Iran or in Arab countries like Syria and Iraq, where Iran has done a lot of war crimes. So people have their own experiences and their own biases, and it can be very difficult to find people who are very careful with evidence. The reason why I point this out is because the way people answer your initial question tends to have everything to do with where their stomach is at and where their heart is at before this war ever started. So it's really important for us to dig deep within ourselves and try to figure out what our own priors are. We call them in political science priors, our own pre-existing biases, and to try to match that up with evidence. I think a lot of people's priors, especially a lot of the people who are most deeply knowledgeable about Iran, tends to be that this regime change war is never going to work, that the Islamic Republic, for all of the different reasons that we mentioned, including decentralization of its most important structures, like between those structures and within those structures, like the IRGC, which really does the job of guarding Iran's external borders like a conventional army would, except with completely unconventional and often quite terroristic tactics, like we're seeing in the Gulf right now. I mean, just today, AP reported that Iran's top military spokesman announced that Iran will be targeting parks, recreational facilities, and even tourist sites around the world to make everybody feel the pain for this invasion. So this use of unconventional terroristic methods is quite common, but there is a tendency to say that for all of these reasons together, the regime is going to stick it out. It's for sure going to last. And I still think analytically that it's very likely to survive. I would be surprised if the Islamic Republic regime does not survive in some form. But at the same time, we have to realize that the US and Israel really are striking quite deep within the regime's central apparatus, to the extent that it has a single central apparatus. It's killed multiple people in the clerical order, it's killed multiple people in the IRGC, and that really does change the nature of the game and change the nature of day-to-day decision making, and who might or might not emerge within the regime. So it's very important that we understand those two dynamics at the same time and admit with humility that really nobody knows what's going to happen. No one truly knows. I think we can adjudicate likelihood based on what we know about Iran, Iran's history, Iran's political culture, its internal organizational structure, how the US and Israel's actions are changing what's able to be said inside Iran, but nobody truly knows. And one more important point on that issue of what's able to be said within Iran. I'm lucky enough to have some friends in Tehran, some Iranian friends who will text me. Now, on day one, on February 28th, the government of Iran shut off the internet to the greatest extent it possibly could, to the extent that by that evening, only 1% of Iranians even had access to the internet. And it did this in the same way that it did this during the protests in January. Whenever the regime feels threatened, as so many authoritarian countries do around the world, it shuts down the internet. So to even be able to text on WhatsApp or on another texting platform like Signal is very, very difficult for Iranians. So I count myself very lucky to have some friends in Iran, and they're so kind. We've been like checking in on each other. They'll ask me, how are you doing in Dubai tonight? Like, I saw that the airport got hit again. How are you holding up? And I'm always thinking to myself, man, you're the ones that I'm worried about, because the nature, like the intensity of the pounding there coming from the sky is just so much worse. People are really going through it. But they've told me, and I've also confirmed, it's also been reported in reliable media outlets, that the Iranian government has announced on television and started announcing very, very soon after this war started, every single night, that any Iranian who goes out on the street to protest will be shot on sight. So the Iranian government is not playing around. They feel existentially threatened from within and without. They're more paranoid than ever, and they're making as many people feel the pain as possible. So this is by no means an easy situation for anyone in Iran. And even though no one really knows what's going to happen, I do think it's quite safe to say that it would be a surprise to the best Iran scholars and the best Iran analysts. I don't count myself among them, but I know who they are and I learn from them, if this regime fell through these military actions.
And given the scale, huge scale of the escalations, many people and observers, maybe decision makers, are asking how the Iranian leadership is framing war domestically. And according to your observations through these few days of the war, Do you think that this war is being presented primarily as a regime survival, or this is more than regime survival, such as part of the broader ideological confrontations with the United States, its regional partners, and even more philosophically toward the Western civilization?
Well, authoritarian regimes don't tend to frame their domestic discourse in purely selfish, transparently opportunistic ways. They're not going to come right out and say, we're afraid for our own asses. They're not going to come right out and say that. They're going to try to define the struggle more broadly. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it time and time again. I'm thinking of multiple examples just within the Middle East and North Africa. When the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi feels threatened, he does not say, I want to hold on to personal power. He says, I want to fight terrorism in Egypt. When President Erdogan in Turkey felt really threatened during the 2016 coup attempt, he didn't say, my own grip on power and my family's grip on power is threatened. He said Turkish democracy is threatened, even though, of course, scholars of democracy have been seeing democracy eroding in Turkey, partly through his actions for years. So I'm not the best expert at all by any stretch of the imagination to expound on this question at length, because I don't speak Farsi. And that means it's impossible for me to have the firsthand ability to monitor internal Iranian regime discourse and to do that discourse analysis myself. But I follow people who are absolutely brilliant and do speak Farsi, and it seems from the reporting and from their analysis, like, absolutely the Iranian regime is framing this US and Israeli intervention as a threat to Iran's sovereignty and Iran's national pride and also its national cohesion. One very important news item that you kind of alluded to a little bit in your intro, but I want to expand on for listeners, is that within the first few days of this war, in the first week of March, it came to light, it was reported that the United States government had been arming Iranian Kurds in Iraq through the CIA. Now, something similar came to light in the early years of Iran's war with Iraq in the early 1980s. And that fear of a Kurdish breakaway part of Iran triggered the regime and the broader Iranian public's fear that Iran would be dismembered. There was this fear that Saddam was working with these Iranian Kurds to break away and dismember the state. And Vali Nasser writes in his book, which I recommend so highly, you can tell I've just been rereading it throughout the war, that it was through that threat that the IRGC itself really overpowered Iran's traditional army and stole, hijacked that role of a traditional army almost. So, I mean, if you know a fact like that, it's just so almost inconceivably stupid that we would be repeating a mistake that was so likely to trigger collective dismemberment fears. Because, there are so many people who disagree inside Iran with Tehran's government. They hate the Islamic Republic. They want to see it disappear. But they don't want to see Iran broken into little pieces. And they don't want to see their UNESCO World Heritage sites hurt. And they don't want to see girls' schools hurt. And they don't want to see their energy burning. And we lost those people. We lost a lot of them very quickly.
And Monica, the geographical scope of the strikes really has been remarkable, with the missiles and drones, Shaheeds, targeting United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Jordan, almost entire, the Gulf region. So what do you think? What is the strategic logic might explain Tehran's decision to strike such a wide range of the neighboring countries and actors at this stage of the conflict? What kind of the benefits really they expect?
There are so many people living in Gulf countries today who come from every different nationality under the sun. You have to remember that in countries like Qatar and the UAE, about 90% of people who live there aren't even citizens of the country. They're foreign residents who come from everywhere. So both a lot of citizens of the Gulf and a lot of foreign residents of the Gulf have been stupefied by that question, have been stunned by it. I had students who were asking me within the first days, why on earth would Iran do this? Are they crazy? I mean, the US and Israel are the belligerents who started this illegal, under international laws of war against them. Shouldn't Iran be responding against them? Maximum, maybe Iran would justify hitting US military bases. It's important to point out that Gulf countries all publicly announced, at least, that the United States was strictly prohibited, from using any part of their territory or their airspace to launch attacks on Iran. And Gulf countries did this for their own self-protection because they had long predicted and long warned Washington, D.C. that Iran was likely to lash out at them instead. And yet Iran did this anyway. So what explains it? I think the best, most logical explanation is that Iran wanted to grab the global economy by the cojones and twist until everybody screamed uncle. It's ironic because either Trump or Hegseth or both in the first week of the war said that we're going to make Iran cry uncle. And now 3 weeks in, it's very clear who's more desperate to end this, it seems. Iran knew that if they close the Strait of Hormuz and if they target energy infrastructure in the Gulf, just yesterday, they destroyed 17% of Qatar's LNG supply, Qatar's natural gas supply. Qatar is the biggest natural gas supplier in the entire world and the #1 natural gas supplier for many European countries. And it's become especially important since Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe has wanted to be less energy reliant on Russia. So Qatar is absolutely key in the global energy infrastructure. And 17% of their natural gas was just destroyed by Iran. Iran knows that doing things like that, targeting the Dubai airport, which has been hit 4 or 5 times, just a few days ago, it was in flames. They hit a jet fuel container there. Doing things like that is very likely to massively increase the prices of global energy. And that's indeed already happening. Prices at the gas pump in the United States have increased very noticeably just in the first 2 weeks of the war. And they're not idiots. They understood that this would create political pressure on Donald Trump because the US, despite some of Trump's efforts, like trying to intimidate news stations through FCC licensing to report more positively on the war, despite some of these efforts, the United States is a democracy. It still has democratic elections. And people don't like to pay more for food and energy. In fact, in 2024, Donald Trump ran on an agenda of lowering costs for people, lowering the cost of eggs. He campaigned all over the United States with a fold-out table that had the most typical groceries that a family would buy in a week and little stickers that said their price under his administration, his first administration, and at the end of Biden's administration. And that has a huge amount to do with how he won the election. So Iran knew that by increasing all of that political pressure through creating economic and energy chaos would put pressure on Trump to end the war sooner. Of course, from the Gulf Arab states' perspective, very little logically explains why Iran has gone as haywire as it's gone on civilian infrastructure, especially in countries like Oman and Qatar, who always tried to be very friendly with Iran and were famous even within the Gulf for having good relations with it, and were even resented by a lot of countries for having good relations with Iran. So even they have been attacked. Ports, energy infrastructure in their countries have been attacked too. There is a case to be made that Iran is lashing out in ways that are going to really screw up its long-term relations after this chapter ends. That's for certain. Things like announcing today that they're going to essentially commit state terrorism against recreational tourist centers, parks around the world. That looks absolutely bonkers. It's deeply immoral and deeply illegal, as are all these attacks on civilian infrastructure from the US, Israel, and Iran. But there is a core of logic to Iran's strategy, which is to increase global economic pain as hugely as possible to increase pressure on Washington, D.C., to then force Israel to ending the war.
there is another important target. Across the region, we have seen air defense systems becoming increasingly active, with countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan, all these countries of the Gulf and other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. They're intercepting incoming missiles, projectiles, and maybe the drones in their own airspace. So, do you think that this coordinated defensive posture we suggest the emergence of a more consolidated regional security alliance against Iran? There is two clear things. Number one, these strikes come from Iran may push the Arab countries or Gulf countries become a neutral, which is less likely. And second, increase the cost of the war. And what will be your response?
So the Gulf Cooperation Council has faced crises before, not nearly of this magnitude. But there have in years past been predictions that the GCC states, which it's basically every state in the Arabian Gulf except Yemen, that all these states would come together and create a more unified, coherent security architecture and maybe even political architecture. That has not come to pass. And so far, it doesn't look like it's coming to pass here again either. If they ever had a reason to do it, it's now.
Just a small point. What about, prior this war, there was another escalation in the region starting from the Red Sea, which was started specifically between United States, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And, all different camps, they blame each other. And then, other countries, they come together like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and partly Turkey through Africa. And then United Arab Emirates, they withdraw from some islands from the Yemen. So do you think that still shouldn't be a possibility, all
I'm not sure exactly what time you're referring to, Lokman.
I'm talking about the most recent, escalation between Saudi Arabia and the Yemen and United Arab Emirates, specifically over the Yemen. The Saudis.
You're talking about in January, this kind of rift that opened up between Saudi and Yemen. Well, I mean, that's another example of internal rivalries, spats, disputes within the GCC that have always divided the bloc. I mean, just within the past 10 years, you can name so many of these. The biggest one, of course, was the 2017 Qatar blockade, when Saudi Arabia and the UAE made the quite a miscalculated decision that they were going to break Qatar's back by blockading it. And they shut their land borders completely. Saudi Arabia even came quite close to doing a land invasion of Qatar. And really the only way that Qatar got food was through the friendship of Turkey and Iran. They patched that up in 2021 at the Al-Ula summit. And in the 2021 Al-Ula summit, it was a very positive summit. It looked like Saudi Arabia and the UAE were coming together with other Gulf players to adopt a more pragmatic policy of pursuing friendships with all neighbors. And they normalized, briefly after that, they normalized relations with Turkey. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been very angry, not only at Qatar, but at the countries they considered to be Qatar's friends, Turkey and Iran. And they normalized relations not only with Qatar in 2021 at that summit, but shortly thereafter with Turkey and with Iran too. So efforts were being put into pragmatic rapprochement, and that was very positive. Now, there were still in other theaters, like most notably Sudan, over the past number of years, big rivalries playing out between different GCC actors, most notably Saudi and the UAE in Sudan. But there was overall, at least within the region itself, within the GCC in particular, and its immediate neighbors like Turkey and Iran, a shift towards more pragmatic rapprochement, which was good. But we've never seen a threat to the GCC's collective economic survival and security survival like the past 3 weeks. So if they ever had a reason to come together and really unite and say, we're going to have one unified, clear response, and we're going to bring our security architecture together, that time is now. But in fact, what we've seen emerge over the past week, in particular, is a range of disunited, lopsided responses. instead of coming together with one position that splits the difference somewhere in the middle, a position that might sound like this. We are completely against the US and Israel's illegal war. Under no circumstances are we joining this war. We know exactly who lit the match. We know exactly who started this fire. But we're not just going to sit here and take it from Iran as they use basically state terrorism against our civilian infrastructure. We're not going to sit here and take it, and we really can't sit here and take it because we don't have unlimited defenses and unlimited economic appetite for this kind of destruction. And we are going to, in a very proportional, very clearly calibrated way, we're going to undertake a more offensive defense against Iran and maybe target the missile or drone launching sites, only those that it has for sure used to target us, but in no way are we joining the US and Israel's illegal war. That's the kind of position that you might imagine a unified GCC in an alternate universe come up with. But that's not the response that anybody's come up with now. We have Oman on the one hand, just one more sentence and then I'll finish. We have Oman on the one hand, not even clearly calling out Iran's attacks on its civilian infrastructure. And then on the other extreme, we have Saudi and the UAE over the past week tilting more than would be advisable towards a US position, towards working with the US. And they're not saying so publicly, but of course that comes along with Israel's position because they're just so upset at Iran's attacks on them. So I'm not super positive about the future of GCC unity at the moment, not yet.
But Monica, I want to make a pretty minor comment here. To what extent GCC countries will be able to remain neutral under the repeated, if at least in the horizon, I don't see any, at least a deal for now. Iran, also officially, they say there will be no deal. We will continue to resist.
Iran has no appetite for diplomacy at the moment. Iran is creating maximum economic havoc, and the more they do that, the longer they do it, and they have all the time in the world, the more likely DC is to give them goodies, for them to actually come out ahead through this whole mess in some respects. Like, for example, maybe an actor as unpredictable as Donald Trump might reduce the sanctions on Iranian oil. Already we have a situation where the US did that with Russia. Russia is now able to sell more oil at higher prices than ever before, which makes it more able to screw up Ukraine, which is a huge problem for Europe. And Iran de facto, under the radar, is doing the same thing. They're selling more oil at higher prices than they were before this war started. And it's possible that with an actor as unpredictable as Trump, that could be formalized into real gains for Iran. I mean, Iran is making some really absurd demands. Like they demanded just yesterday that the United Arab Emirates send them what did they call it? Like a package of money to pay for the damage that they did to their country somehow. Reparations. Yeah, Iran demanded reparations from the UAE. It was pretty absurd. But anyway, I think most analysts of the Gulf would agree that Iran has really pushed Gulf states more towards needing more US weapons and towards working more closely with the US, even though the GCC states, none of them wanted this war to start. All of them were livid and incredibly betrayed by Trump for starting this war that was going to be so awful for them, that they had lobbied so hard against. But once it started, Iran went really haywire on their civilian infrastructure. And there's no alternative right now to the kinds of weaponry and intelligence that the US can provide. Even if they wished that there was an alternative, it just doesn't exist. So public enemy number one for GCC states, starting on February 28th, was Iran. As of February 27th, all GCC states, including the UAE, I would argue, and I argued in a timepiece that I wrote about how much the Abraham Accords agreement between Israel and the UAE had frayed. Even in the UAE, even in the friendliest GCC countries, public enemy number one really was, in the region, was Israel. It was considered the biggest threat, to put a finer point on it. It was considered to be the biggest threat to regional security by every GCC state as of February 27th. Iran changed that. And Iran backed GCC countries into a corner where now they're in this super awkward position of forking over fat wads of cash to buy new weapons from the very country who created this giant fire that has consumed them, and that is the United States.
And now, just try to understand better the nature of this conflict, the consequences, the implications of this ongoing war. Most recently, there is also a report about suggesting that the elements of the new leadership may have been injured in recent strikes, which is the Mujtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader. So under these conditions, do you believe that the military campaign is still being directed by a centralized leadership structure, or are operational decisions increasingly being carried through the decentralized command networks within the security apparatus? Because this is important. If Iran still able to keep its centralized command, it will have effect specifically on the Gulf countries. But if Iran lost its centralized command and the missiles, ballistics, hypersonics, supersonics launched across the large geography of Iran toward its neighbors, it will change the calculation and consequences of war again.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the internal dynamics, and specifically the reports about the injuring of the new supreme leader Mujtaba?
So I try to be totally honest when I don't know what I'm talking about, and this is not a question that I can talk about with for any kind of firsthand expertise. Like the vast majority of scholars and analysts who work on the region, all except for those who are most deeply knowledgeable about Iran, journalists like the New York Times' Farnaz Fasihi, for example, Iranian scholars like Ali Vayaz of the International Crisis Group, those are the types of people who can really answer that question. Person like me, I listen to and I read from and I learn from their work. And from their work, what I've learned is that the command and control structure inside Iran was set up to be quite decentralized, especially in moments of crisis. So Khamenei, before he was assassinated by the US and Israel in its attacks on the very first day of this war, on February 28th, Khamenei had put a command structure in place where if this war were to break out, all of these dozens of different decentralized, independently self-controlling, more or less, units within the IRGC had instructions to independently decide means of targeting Gulf countries and surrounding countries to the maximum extent of their ability to create the overall energy and economic chaos that we're seeing today. So, you saw there a set of commands from the supreme leader, from the late Khamenei, but these commands were going through to quite a decentralized structure. And it seems like that's still the case in many respects. But again, we're all palpating the elephant blindly here. We're all looking through a glass darkly. There's very little great information coming out of Iran. The fact that only 1% of Iranians even have the internet is a huge obstacle to getting good information. The fact that Iranians are so petrified, they're so terrified of their regime, looking for traitors under every corner, real and suspected traitors, gunning them down. That's another big obstacle to getting good information. A third obstacle is that it's very hard for journalistic outlets or analytical outlets abroad to even pay Iranian analysts in Iran because of the sanctions. So we're really, one of the many very, very dangerous elements of this war is that we're working with such little knowledge about the Iranian regime's internal dynamics and how those are shifting from one minute to the next. Huge decisions are being made in Washington, D.C. by people who it seems have not read a single decent published book about Iran, let alone are staying up to date with firm networks inside the country. But I'll add one more element to this to just throw on some more texture. The Iranian government has, over the past few weeks, gaslit and dissembled a great deal towards countries that it has attacked. I think this is one of the things that creates the most confusion about where the commands are coming from, and also creates the most consternation and anger among the countries being targeted, because not only is Iran targeting them, it's targeting their civilian sites, and it's not even owning up to the fact that it's targeting them or their civilian sites. This happened to Turkey. This happened to Azerbaijan. And it's happened to all the Gulf Arab countries. In other words, Iran has targeted them, and then you'll have the president, Pezeshkian, claiming that he did not give the orders to target some of these places. For example, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Oman. Pezeshkian said, no, we didn't give central orders to target these places. So, what kind of government are we dealing with here? What's going on? Who's giving the orders? There are these huge questions. Why can't the Iranian government just say very clearly, yes, we're targeting hotels, we're targeting airports, and here's why. If you really follow Iranian regime media, including its propaganda videos, you'll see very clearly that in Iran's internal statements and internal propaganda, it shows itself, it really does show itself targeting hotels and targeting airports. There's this wild video. I don't know if you've seen it, Lokman. It has Legos. It's illustrated with like AI created Lego people. And it's a propaganda video created by the Iranian government. And you see like one of Dubai's most famous hotels being targeted. And you see its airport being targeted. Airports in Kuwait, Bahrain, etc., were targeted too. So, just to wrap it up on that question, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration about where the commands are coming from and why Iran does not take more ownership for its actions.
And just a little bit go to the philosophical side, maybe the political scientist side of this war. There is another really striking development has been the hesitation of some traditional U.S. allies and Western partners to deploy the naval assets into the Gulf, despite requests from Washington, D.C. So could this indicate emerging strain within the Western alliance under the pressure of this conflict?
I didn't understand the first part of the question. What about the U.S. assets in the Gulf?
I just said some traditional Western countries, traditional U.S. allies, Western countries,
like France and Britain, for example.
They refuse Washington request to deploy the naval assets to the Gulf.
I'm not exactly sure where that stands. I know that France and Britain and Australia and South Korea in different ways, either through weapon sales or through deploying some teams, in the case of France and Britain, have helped guard the skies of GCC countries, including the UAE, where I live. But I also know that Trump has, within the past few days, really been, he wouldn't like this word, but begging NATO to come to his aid and to help accompany ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump never made the case for this war, either domestically to us as American citizens or internationally to American allies. And in fact, Donald Trump has really been a menace to multilateral institutions and to American allies worldwide in both his first and especially his second terms. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that no NATO country is excited for this mission. It's not that NATO countries are not themselves threatened by what's happening, or that US allies are not affected. The entire world is affected. In particular, Europe's natural gas supplies are being really, really affected, and they're going to be affected even worse. It's in everybody's interest to come together and stop this nightmare, but nobody knows how to stop it. And despite Trump's claims that this is a short excursion and like a very easy military operation, very, very simple to accompany ships through the Strait of Hormuz, NATO partners know better. The Strait of Hormuz is a very narrow waterway. I need to sit down and check this, but I think the distance between that tip, the Arab tip of the land that goes into the strait, like the UAE and Oman are on that side, and the Iranian side, I think that's about the distance between like Manhattan and Staten Island. Like the Staten Island ferry could take you across it. It's like 20 miles long. It's a very narrow strip of water, and it's one of the world's most important energy choke points. So you have essentially, I was reading from a ship captain, a post online the other day, who works in that strait. He was saying, you have essentially, it's essentially a 4-lane highway, 2 lanes going on either side. And Iran has high mountains on its side that it can use to target and shoot down at these ships. Now, you tell me, is that an easy type of mission to accompany and protect other ships on? It's really, really not. Nobody wants to go into the gauntlet, right into the shooting gallery, no matter how well equipped they are. So, yes, there have been American allies stepping up, certainly behind the scenes, to help the UAE, to help Qatar, to help Saudi and other GCC countries defend their skies. But none of them have been willing to ally with Donald Trump in this illegal, under international law, and absolutely masochistically self-harming for Western interests war.
Monica, since you mentioned the Strait of the Hormuz, it is important for the global energy transit. This is another important, even most important topic: the energy, how it being affected by this war. The markets have reacted sharply, with oil prices rising rapidly and concerns emerging about the supply disruptions. So, according to your experience and observations, how serious is the risk that continued instability in the Gulf can trigger a broader global economic shock? I think already we have some implications. The countries like Bangladesh, they shut down their schools, their universities. The Philippines, give notification, and I think they also shut up some elementary or primary school due to the energy. And as I initially mentioned, the Japan, maybe 2019, are dependent to this narrow strait. How it will affect? What will be your takes?
We're already seeing a huge global economic shock, and it's only going to get worse. And it's definitely going to get much worse before it gets better. Even if the war stopped today, prices of energy would be increasing for the next few months, because a number of countries in the Gulf states, including Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain to different extents, have had to shut off big parts of their energy production. In particular, Qatar, because it's farther upstream and it doesn't have as many storage facilities for its energy. If the energy can't be shipped out, it can't just be indefinitely produced and stored. They don't have indefinite storage capacity. So they actually had to basically shut off the pipes. And it takes a long time to restart the pipes. It's not a matter of just an on or an off switch. We're talking about a matter of months to get things back up and flowing normally again. So in the very best case, magical thinking, fantasia scenario, where Donald Trump and the Islamic Republic regime and Benjamin Netanyahu all decide to put down their weapons today, which sure as hell is not going to happen, unfortunately, we're going to see months of worsening oil prices. And the longer it lasts, the worse it's going to get. Another important element that needs to be highlighted to answer your question holistically is the effect to global humanitarian aid. Very often commentary on the Gulf states, certainly on Dubai, tends to fall into one of two buckets. Either genuflecting sycophancy, Kool-Aid drinkers, everything's fine, these are the best countries in the world, everything's fabulous, people who just essentially parrot the authoritarian government's line, on the one hand. Or on the other hand, people who almost evince a kind of like Dubai derangement syndrome. Like this place is just a bunch of like glitzy, annoying Lamborghini drivers, Western influencers, and then like a slave class. And there's nothing in between. And both buckets are very polarized, very ideological, very tribalistic, and very inaccurate. They're not seeing the entire picture. And both of these groups, for their own different reasons, are not talking about the importance of Dubai as a central node in humanitarian aid distribution for a lot of the very poorest countries in the Middle East and Africa. Despite the UAE government's adventurism with the RSF, which is accused of committing genocide in Sudan, Dubai, at the same time, serves as a really essential humanitarian aid distribution hub. The World Food Program, for example, conducts most of its operations, its logistics, for the very poorest African and Middle Eastern countries, which include a lot of the world's very poorest countries, as we know, from its distribution hubs in Dubai. There was an excellent article the other day that I shared on X by a friend and a journalist, analyst, wonderful writer named Bobby Ghosh that really talked. It was the first article to really talk about in detail this. But a number of these humanitarian aid distributors have, over the past few years, been my friends in Dubai behind the scenes. And for people who were really in the know about Dubai's importance to global aviation, energy, and humanitarian distribution, this war from the beginning was a tragedy on so many levels. Not only for all of the many millions of people who've come to that city for seeking better opportunity, including a lot of people who've come from war zones themselves, from Ukraine, Syria, Palestine, Sudan, and had managed to build a better life for their families, but also for countries that consume energy that flows through the Strait of Hormuz, including a lot of the poorest Asian countries. You mentioned Bangladesh. You were absolutely right to mention Bangladesh. It's already doing remote education and really being impacted. But Sri Lanka and a number of other very poor Asian countries like Nepal are also very much in the first worst line of fire here. But we're also thinking about some of the very poorest countries in Africa that are going to be hit the hardest. So, one thing that's really been nauseating to me personally to watch is when analysts tend to fall into one of these hyper ideological buckets and not first think about the multiple orders of human tragedy and human catastrophe in a war like this, and reflexively try to pick a side. I think we should all avoid that. We should all be thinking about civilian suffering everywhere, not only within the region, Lebanon, Iran, the Gulf countries, Israel, but we should be thinking about civilian suffering beyond the region because of this war.
Due to the complex nature of this war, and it's already regionalized, and it has global economical, financial, energy implications across specifically Asian countries. So could this prolonged instability specifically in the Gulf accelerate debates about alternative energy routes? Currencies. I'm going to mention another amazing point here, and our financial arrangements beyond the traditional frameworks that has dominated the global markets. I read from some reports on X. I'm not sure whether it is verified or not. The reports suggest that Iran wants to receive the payments from the oil dependent countries, not with USD. Instead, USD, they want to take the Chinese RMB yuans. And what will be your thoughts?
We know that every time there's a massive prolonged energy shock, like there was in the early 1970s with the so-called Arab energy crisis, that really made energy unaffordable for a lot of Americans. My mom told me when I was growing up about when she was in school in the early 1970s, shivering in the winter in her classrooms because they didn't have heat or they had to turn the heat way down. Americans are not used to that. It was a historical generational shock that people remembered decades later, and it was prolonged, so it started to change behavior. That's what happens with prolonged energy shocks. People start to look for alternative sources of energy. They start to open up their own maybe energy if they can. They start to go towards maybe EVs or solar, etc. So that's certainly a fear, a concern for energy producing states like the Gulf Arab states. Another part of your question, if I understood you correctly, was could this war accelerate the hunt for alternative maybe currencies? The American dollar is the global reserve currency. It's the currency that currencies are held and traded in throughout the world. And that gives the United States a whole lot of power. From a US perspective, we want to keep on being the world's currency. But A lot of countries that have been upset at our sanctions and our global financial monitoring and regulations have long wanted to escape our control over global currency. And interestingly, perhaps ironically, in some ways, the United Arab Emirates, where I live, has been one of those countries for years. The United Arab Emirates, in particular Dubai, cares a lot about pragmatic neo-mercantilism. That's really the governing philosophy of Dubai more than anything else. They just want to take your money, wherever you happen to be from. They've even taken a lot of Iranian hot money over the years. And in 2013, the United States started clamping down more on the UAE's financial regulations, on its banks, etc., to make the UAE clamp down on Iranian hot money. And the UAE did that, but there's still a bit going on, and you'll see it reported on. Even just today, new reports have come out about Iranian money through like shell companies and fake passports and things being in the UAE, and in particular in Dubai, which is one of the many reasons why Dubai is shocked that Iran not only attacked the UAE so hard, but has been hitting the hell out of Dubai's civilian infrastructure, because Dubai has a history of wanting to do trade and commerce with Iran. Dubai has also felt the same way about Russia. Dubai did not enjoy America's sanctions of Russia. So, I've sat in on conferences with Emirati think tankers, decision makers, intellectuals in years past, like in 2021, 2022, where the entire topic of the conversation, maybe for an hour or more than an hour, will be, can we go off the dollar? Is there a way to get off the dollar? So this is all to say that there has been a pre-existing urge, desire, hunt for that alternative, maybe basket of currencies, but it just hasn't been realistically feasible yet. But rest assured that no matter what even the more pro-American in their rhetoric Gulf countries like the UAE and Saudi say right now, rest assured that they are not at all happy with the United States throwing their very existential security under the bus by starting this war on February 28th. They're going to remember who lit the match, absolutely. And they're going to be looking for alternatives. The US is lucky right now because no clear alternatives to us militarily or in terms of global currency exist, but no empire lasts forever. And we're laying the building blocks. I mean, I guess we're chipping away at the foundations of our global empires to the extent that it exists supremacy. You can see that happening in real time.
And Monica, looking at the broader strategic picture of this ongoing war, if this military campaign doesn't produce expected or whether a rapid political outcome, what might it be? It's for the future of the global leadership, it is governance implications. Do you think that this conflict can accelerate the transition toward a more clearly multipolar world order?
I think you already see that happening, at least through public opinion shifts in U.S. allies across the world. So there was really interesting reporting that came out a few days ago. It might have been up to a week ago. Again, that I shared on social media widely, based on polling in different U.S. ally countries, including France, around Europe and around the world, basically asking people, which country do you have the most positive impressions of? And they were surveying not just decision makers, not just government, but the broader public, trying to get a representative sample in each country. So polling at least 1,000 people, I think it was like a couple thousand people were polled in every country. And the results were shocking. From an American perspective, the bar graph should terrify Washington, D.C. because in every single country, China came out ahead. China's positive public perception was way ahead of the United States by a considerable margin. We're talking differences of like 20 percentage points. That's really shocking that Western democracies are feeling more positive about the CCP's authoritarian system and its role in the world stage than ours. I think that tells you just how far off the rails the United States has gone over the past few years. These have been a very destructive past few years. And it's not just the Republicans and the Trump administration who bear blame. It's also absolutely shared by the Democrats in the Biden administration. What they let Israel's government, Netanyahu, get away with in its prosecution, its revenge of October 7th in Gaza was really beyond the pale, I think, to the vast majority of simple, good-hearted people who tuned into the news at any point during Israel's retaliation, restricting food and water, hitting so many civilian areas, reducing people to tents and then bombing the tents, seeing children burned to a crisp. I mean, it became hard for even my students to tune into TikTok or to Instagram and be able to sleep at night sometimes. And Biden gave Netanyahu a free rein and seemed to be missing in action. And this really, really ripped apart international law, it ripped apart the United States global standing. And it's not the first time that that's happened, of course. The Iraq War in 2003 did a lot of damage. I think Obama helped restore a lot of the US's reputation globally. But now that this war has been unleashed since February 28th, this is just unspeakably, I hate to be this crass in my language, but I do value candor and being direct. It's unspeakably stupid. And it's unspeakably self-harming for the US and for the world. And people are watching this and they're registering the complete blithe, selfish insouciance with which we play with global food and energy prices of our allies, of poor countries, for our own American consumers. I mean, it's really, really insulting. Yes, we're going to see long-term impact, I think, to American dominance, and we've created big openings for alternative allies, military suppliers, etc. Will Russia and China and other countries, even Turkey, like middle powers like Turkey, capitalize on those openings? We'll see. I mean, we'll certainly be trying to in various avenues, various respects. But I think one important political impact that I also want to talk about is domestic politics in the United States. I think a lot of people are shocked purely from a US domestic politics perspective that this war has lasted as long as it has. Can you still hear me okay? I'm hearing a slight echo.
Yes, Jess, I'm deeply interested to your observation.
Okay, great. As long as I'm still coming through clearly. It's remarkable that Trump even started this war, given that in any war game with any remotely knowledgeable analyst, one of the very first things you knew was going to happen was Iran was going to shut the Strait of Hormuz, and global energy prices, including in the United States at the gas pump, were going to soar. That was obvious. Everybody knew that, except maybe Trump and the maybe 5 or 6 people pushing him to do this war. So it's already come to pass. And it's even more shocking that he's let it continue as long as it has, because if there's one thing that it seems like Donald Trump cares about, it's the way the stock market's going. It's the way that public opinion polls are going within the United States. The Republican Party has become more enthralled to Trump's almost cult of personality in recent years. But if this war continues through to the summer, and especially to the late summer, you're going to see a variety of Republican candidates running for congressional seats in our midterm elections, which are scheduled for November, up and down the United States, whose polling numbers are going to be existentially threatening to those candidacies, in large part because of the energy shock created by this war. It would be absolutely stunning if the war lasted that long and Trump let it continue. It really makes no sense in terms of political self-interest. Does Trump care about the Republican Party at all? Or does Trump just care about Trump? Whatever happened to make America great again? Whatever happened to America first? This is the exact opposite of America first. This is an illegal, unnecessary war in a country that was not posing. Yes, it's a pain in the ass regime, sure. The US has never gotten along with Iran, and Iran does pose real security threats to the US and its allies. But no analyst worth their salt, nuclear or otherwise, saw an imminent threat coming from Iran to the United States. So this is really a war of choice, and it's a war of choice that had predictably disastrous consequences for American consumers at the pump and at the grocery store, which is exactly what they were promised by the America First movement that they were not going to get.
looking ahead to the coming weeks, do you see any realistic pathway toward the de-escalations, whether through the regional mediations or another way, or already we cross the thresholds of this diplomacy that makes such outcomes increasingly difficult?
Yeah, I mean, what you're really asking about here is, does the United States or anybody else have a war termination strategy? How is this giant fire going to be put out? Does anybody know? I recommend to your listeners an excellent podcast. It's the Foreign Affairs Interview Podcast. You can find it on Spotify. There's a man named Richard Haas, who's affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations, who was interviewed for that in the first week of this war. And he really highlighted before most analysts that Trump went into this completely lacking a war termination strategy. And he also predicted before most that Iran was very likely to actually find that it was coming out ahead through this war and to want to continue taking the Gulf Arab states hostage, using them as whipping boys, going after their energy, going after their civilian infrastructure, keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed, screwing up global energy and global economics until it can cajole Washington, D.C. to not only stop its and Israel's attacks, but to actually give Iran something. Now, from a U.S. perspective, that's complete and utter failure. That's naked defeat. Trump has a history in New York real estate. This is really how he got his fabulous riches and got his reputation in his reality TV show that he built his first candidacy on. He has this reputation as being a great bullshitter, like a great bullshit artist who was able to succeed in New York real estate by essentially upselling and lying, kind of like a carnival barker or snake oil salesman sometimes, that real estate was better than it really was, and that deals were better than they really were. So we can expect Trump to start to try to spin any degree of failure as success. But can we expect the broader Republican Party or Americans as a whole to buy it? Not clear. What might we offer Iran to make them stop doing what they're doing if we can't stop them militarily? And it's not at all clear that we can. Also, will the United States do anything to make Israel stop? One big fear from the Gulf Arab perspective, and from all the states caught in between this mess or around this mess, including Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, all the Gulf Arab GCC states, one of their big fears is that Trump's famously short attention span and America's famous inability to see through its Middle East wars to completion is inevitably creating a shorter timeline for the United States than Iran is playing with, so that the US is going to pull out of this and leave them holding the bag as these two ideological, expansionist, very regionally destabilizing players, Israel and Iran, keep duking it out. That is not ending the war. That is not war termination. That's war continuation with an early American pullout. That is not restoring stability to the Gulf Arab states or to energy markets at all. That's a really terrifying and also very, very likely scenario. For the countries in between, they often feel like they're caught between two insane asylums, as ideological expansionist regimes in Israel and in Iran keep duking it out. There's a wish that they could go to some island and fight it out together and not have to involve the rest of us. But that's not the reality that we live in. So yeah, I encourage everybody to listen to that podcast with Richard Haas and to really sit with just how criminally little planning Washington, D.C. put into war termination strategies. It seemed that Trump assumed that this would be a cakewalk a la Venezuela, that he would find his Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, but he was dealing with an entirely different kettle of fish. And he really and truly opened Pandora's box and is wreaking havoc on global energy and economics right now.
Monica, as a scholar of the Islamic movement, Middle East, international relations, gender studies, and when you look at the ongoing nature of this war, There is a stakeholders, parties, whether this side is right, this side is wrong. What kind of what do you believe is the single, I think, the most important aspect of this war that the public is currently misunderstand, and what developments should be observers around the world be watching most carefully in the months ahead, because this war is affect to everyone around the world, every single persons, from the primary school students to the laborers in companies, and the peoples in the terrain working, maybe even some villagers in the deep side of the Asia or maybe Latin America. They even doesn't have regular information what was going in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf. But at the end of the day, they have implications. The prices of good are increasing. The energy costs, became a burden, mounting over the shoulders of the governments, the decision makers. And on the other hand, specifically the Gulf countries and some other Arab countries like Iraq, like the KRG, like the Saudi Arabia, Jordan, they are under the missile and drone attack. And all these things, just I want to link it with your studies, your scholar articles and publications. Specifically, our topic is, we are the one most important part of this war is Islamic Republic of Iran. And through your experience, what kind of the most important misunderstand things by the lay public or even educated people?
To the last part of your question, which guided me to look at the so-called Islamic regime, a lot of Muslims would disagree, regime in Iran. I would direct people to Vali Nasser's wonderful book, yet again. And one of his key insights in the introduction of that book, that I think has a lot of applications for the current context, is this. Most people tend to see, especially Western observers, looking outside into Tehran, they tend to see a religiously crazy, hyper-ideological, super-duper just Islamist wingnut regime, in which Islamism is the most important feature. But Nasser's argument, and the arguments of a number of other excellent scholars of Iranian politics, is that the regime will sacrifice Islamism before it sacrifices this obsessive paranoia, this real obsessive opposition to outside intervention, denial of sovereignty, and dismemberment. Those were the things that created the classic red-green alliance between the Marxist left and the Islamist right that created the 1979 revolution against the US-supported Shah of Iran. And those are the things that, in this time and place today, create a rally round the flag effect for the regime in Tehran, including people who hate the regime when they're afraid that the CIA is backing Iranian Kurdish breakaway actors, when they see civilian infrastructure attacked, when they see these classic adversaries like the United States and Israel, who really don't seem to have the interest of Iranian civilians at heart at all, interfering in this way and creating this level of destruction, that actually makes them less likely to do a kind of revolution to topple the regime. So I'd leave that there. And then I would point out 4 other things that answer the first part of your question. The first part of your question really asked me, what are the things that most people are missing, in my view? I would say there are 4 things that, like, average observers tend to get wrong that I would suggest everybody look at. So first of all, I think there's a tendency to misunderstand Israel's intentions versus the US's intentions in this war. And that misunderstanding exists not just among the lay public globally, reading the news casually, but it exists within the government inside Washington, D.C. itself. And here's the difference between their end goals. The United States wanted a kind of regime, a more pro-US regime tweak in Iran, a la Venezuela, and it mistakenly thought that that was achievable. Israel, on the other hand, really wants to break Iran's power, no matter who is governing Iran. Even if Iran had complete regime change, I think Israel would really feel a lot more comfortable with a situation in which Iran, or really any other state in the region, does not have much military hardware to play with, is internally dismembered and divided, because Israel's right-wing government has tended to see every other country in the region as a threat to be controlled rather than an ally to be managed and worked with. And Israel has its own, Israel's government has its own ideologies and paranoias that make it feel this way. But Israel's intentions are especially concerning for regional stability. The second thing I would mention is that both people tend to fall, like I keep saying, into one of these two ideological buckets. If people are more pro-Israel and pro-US, maybe more right-wing, they tend to talk a lot about the Iranian regime's crimes, how it's targeting civilian infrastructure in the Gulf, how repressive it is of its own people, but they don't stay consistent and principled and talk about the US and Israel's targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran and their crimes. And then there's people who are more sympathetic to Iran. They tend to be more on the global left, who do the exact opposite thing, who tend to be apologists for Tehran's crimes, but will reliably flag up the US and Israel's. I would tell people to be very aware that there is a great deal of ideological bias across the entire terrain, including in the highest, most respected vantages of academia. And journalism and the think tank world and everything else. So I would advise average observers to use the following rubric for any conflict, for any war, and certainly for this one, to judge who is and is not more of a reliable voice. And here's the one question, here's the litmus test. Does this voice, does this newspaper, does this analyst, does this journalist, does this scholar talk about harm to civilians done by both sides, by the US and Israel and by Iran? Because both sides are doing them, and I highlighted a number, but there's even more that I didn't mention. So, the US and Israel launched an illegal, unnecessary war against Iran under international law that has targeted civilian sites like energy and like water desalination. But in return, in retaliation, which I think is a completely inappropriate term because it's retaliating against states that never wanted this war in the first place, from Turkey and Azerbaijan to the Gulf Arab states. Iran launched its own illegal war of retaliation against those actors, in which it has also been targeting civilian infrastructure right and left since day one. And I don't have much time for analysts who can't talk about both consistently. The third thing I would advise people to do is understand that there's no good way out of this. In terms of war termination, which we were just talking about, Lokman, there are exclusively bad options. I cannot, off the top of my head, think about any way that this ends that's not either awful or unrealistic. The options I can think of that are not awful are also not realistic. So, the Trump administration really started something that it didn't know how to end. And this is terrible. That's why people like myself can talk to you all day long about the 2,000 reasons why this war was stupid to start, and all day long about the terrible global impacts of this war, inside and outside the region. But you don't hear many of us at all. In fact, I really haven't heard any of us talk about ways to end this, because all the ways to end this are either infeasible or they completely suck, and they're very unlikely to be taken up by any actor. And then the fourth and last thing I would say is in wartime especially, and especially in contexts where there's so much ideological tribalism clouding the picture, clouding our analysis, it's especially important to try to tune in to those rare people who have a history of evidence-based, nuanced, careful, cautious analysis. I created a thread on X and on Blue Sky where I tried to highlight some of those, also on Instagram for anyone who's interested. I left out some wonderful people. It's not an exhaustive list. You can bicker with some of the people I included on the list, but I thought that was an important kind of public service, because so many of the voices that we see, at least on American news media, on cable news, tend to come in one of the other ideological flavors. Like, the other night I saw Bernie Sanders interviewing a panel of people who are experts on Iran. And they managed to speak, 3 people managed to speak for 42 minutes about Iran without once mentioning its crimes against civilian infrastructure in the Gulf. But the US and Israel's crimes were mentioned a lot. So we had a kind of more left biased camp. But then, you have Fox News, on the other hand, in the United States, which is every bit as biased in the pro-Israel, pro-right-wing US administration perspective as it was in 2003, when that disastrous war in Iraq was launched. So I think it's important that people really try to tune in to time-worn, proven, nuanced, evidence-based actors who really try to do the hard work of not falling into one of these reflective, tribalistic buckets.
Thank you very much, Monica. Really, you painted a great, deep, and comprehensive picture about the ongoing situation in Iran.
That's very generous.
The war, and the war is, really a serious business, not a machine game or a simple, fight between 2 high school students. It affects the daily life of the people. They have economic, health, deep psychological effects on the people, specifically those who are living in the war region. This is really, and just I want to go through your comments. You really mentioned an important topic. Maybe this is one of the most important topic. Not only late audiences, as educated people we are missing. Why no one are talking about how to end this war? What can be, as a scholar, as an academician or researchers, what can be our contributions to reduce the level of this conflict, of this war on the planet Earth, to the at least minimal level. All these things is really very important. I really appreciate your comments, your observations. In my part, with my experts, I try to really, in opposite to the mainstream media or some 30 minutes. Of course, the format of my shows 1 hour or 2 hours also not enough. I am aware about that. It's not enough to understand the consequences, implications, and the reason of this war. But at least as educated people or scholars, educational people, we try to understand these situations. And this is one of the reasons of my podcast. The people with different background, different academic background, research background, practical background, maybe different ideological background, from the religious, from the politics, from the academia. We try to bring all different views and how we can contribute to the mankind in a peaceful way. And once again, Monica, thank you very much for joining me and share your experience with my audiences.
Thank you very much. I'll just say in conclusion, seeing another terrible war with horrific global impacts, the likes of which you just spoke to in your comments about civilian harm, breaking out as a result of my own government's actions is deeply, deeply sad, almost inexpressibly sad to watch, especially as a Middle East politics professor. I think so many of us thought if there's one thing we can do, it's try to offer the public and our government's expertise to make disasters like this less likely. And very often it feels like we're shouting into a void that no one is really listening. So I think that makes it all the more important that people like you with platforms like yours exist. And just I just want to offer so much thanks to all the people that we can't see who might be listening, who might be searching for more expertise in a very tragic and confusing time.
Yes, exactly. I agree. We try to do our best in the future, in the present. We have to understand this conflict, at least, as a maybe middle class or scholar or the researchers. This is our responsibility and huge responsibility on our shoulders. I deeply believe that. Because the life of the civilian is matter, whatever the government and the decision makers they are thinking about the cash consequences of the geopolitics, like the energy consequences or the stakes. But as an educated people, the people who are reading the book, at the beginning of the show, you say, you mentioned that my background, that is the historical book. Yes, the people who are reading the book, or they have knowledge at least about the different culture, different people, different region. We really need to understand, and this is the biggest obstacles the maybe lay audiences are faced. The mainstream media, they push maybe different narratives about the war from the both sides, from the Iranian side, from the Gulf side, from the US and Israeli side. But I think the responsibility, the common responsibility, mutual responsibility of these people, we have to understand and wish in working for hope in the bright future for next generations and our people, our mankind. Thank you very much, Monica, again.
Almost anybody wanted. It was the Ramadan that we got. Inshallah, it will be better. I think no matter what religion we are or aren't, I think we all hope for better. And thank you so much, Lokman.
You're welcome, and also I want to send a great appreciations and thanks to my audiences. You watched us, you being with us until end of the show. You send your comments. Our shows take a lot of time. We are around, I think, more than 1 hour and 47 minutes. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit notification bell. We have many upcoming live streams from education to geopolitics to sustainability. Everything we try to put our efforts to make a good future for our next generations. Stay tuned and see you on the next live stream episode.